I'd like to welcome you to our second speaker event in our Housing Access and Affordability series. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, it looks like everyone's been able to come in from the waiting room. So thank you so much. My name is Brittany Mellinger. I'm the director of the Housing Equality and Equity Institute at Tenfold. And this is our second speaker in our Housing Access and Affordability speaker series. If you missed our first speaker, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, you can find the recording on our Facebook page. I'd like to thank you all for attending. If you have questions throughout Dr. Rothstein's talk, you can place them in the chat or the Q&A box, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. I'd like to give a brief acknowledgement to our funders, to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to the City of Lancaster and the Lancaster County Housing and Redevelopment Authority for supporting the series and the work of the Housing Equality and Equity Institute. Our goal is really to expand the conversation and understanding around issues that impact our community's ability to access fair and affordable housing. But before we get started with the main event, Dr. Richard Rothstein, I'd like to invite Shelby Nauman, Tenfold's Chief Impact Officer, to say a few words.
Thanks, Brittany. We're so excited to have Dr. Rothstein join us to further key conversations about how fair housing issues impact our community. Through our work at the Housing Equality and Equity Institute and Tenfold, our goal goes beyond educating individuals about their fair housing rights and responsibilities, but also to better understand the policies that have limited housing opportunities for people in our communities, and to work to expand those opportunities for stable housing and financial security for everyone in our region. In addition, I want to take just a minute to tell you about our organization, Tenfold. Tenfold is the uniting of two established and robust organizations, Tabor Community Services, which was founded in 1968, and Lancaster Housing Opportunity, which was founded in 1994, for a combined 80 years of serving our community. The leadership of both organizations began exploring the idea of a merger in 2019, and in January 2021, we officially united and became Tenfold with the goal of greater impact for our clients, our funders, and our partners. By collaborating as one team, we take a holistic approach to serve as your trusted community partner focused on achieving quality, fair, and affordable housing for all people through proactive coaching, education, lending, and advocacy. We provide services that include homeless outreach, emergency housing, supportive housing, landlord and tenant resources, financial empowerment programs and counseling, neighborhood revitalization, specifically the So We initiative, and community lending. You can learn more at our new website, which launches tomorrow at www.wearetenfold.org. At Tenfold, we are committed to sparking the power in all people to achieve equitable housing and financial security. We walk alongside our clients and help them unlock a brighter future. Now I want to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Richard Rothstein is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Dr. Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which recovers a forgotten history of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogeneous neighborhoods in patterns that violate the Constitution and require remediation. Dr. Rothstein lives in California, where he is a fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. And now it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Rothstein.
Well, thank you very much, Shelby, and Brittany as well, and all of you for engaging with me in this conversation this evening. Shelby, you'll have to forgive me for correcting you. First of all, I'm no doctor. And secondly, I'm an old retired guy who just gets a lot of useless titles. So I think the only thing you need to know about me is that I wrote this book describing how we came to be so segregated. And in talking about it, let me put it in a different context for you. As you may know, in the 1960s, 1950s, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools and in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, succeeded in persuading the Supreme Court to banish, prohibit segregation, ongoing segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then that Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education decision, gave inspiration, stimulus to a movement of civil rights activists. They were locally based. They engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives. Others were seriously injured. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded the country, not everybody, but most people, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. With that understanding, it persuaded much of the country of. It succeeded in ending segregation in lunch counters, public accommodations of all kinds, and public transportation, buses, trains, employment in many cases. And then in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting past a Fair Housing Act that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But then the civil rights movement pretty much ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could it be that the civil rights movement ended, that we came to an understanding that residential segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with a democratic society, and yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, partly it's because it's hard to desegregate neighborhoods. We'd now rather not think about something that's hard to do. If we passed a law prohibiting segregation of neighborhoods the next day, of restaurants rather, the next day you could go to any restaurant you want, sit anywhere you want in that restaurant. But if we passed a law prohibiting the segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, is we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not addressing this biggest segregation of all. The excuse goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation forms that we eliminated in the 20th century, whether of schools and colleges or buses or transportation or lunch counters or restaurants, that was all done by government. That was created by government, that segregation. If a local government was requiring segregation of restaurants, that was a 14th Amendment violation of the Constitution, a civil rights violation. As Americans, we have an obligation to fix civil rights violations. So we redress that. If the federal government was doing it, requiring, for example, segregation of trains, that was a Fifth Amendment violation, something that also is a civil rights violation and something that we as Americans are obligated to fix. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government, wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. It was just the result of private activity. It happened naturally. It happened by accident. We have residential segregation because maybe bigoted white homeowners or landlords refuse to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe we've got it because of purely private prejudice, discriminatory, bigoted activity. Real estate agencies, banks, law firms, developers, insurance companies, all discriminated on the basis of race and how they carried out their purely private sector activities that had nothing to do with government. Or maybe we tell ourselves we've got residential segregation because people just like to live with each other, the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. We'd rather be around people like ourselves. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just a result of income differences. On average, African Americans have smaller incomes than whites, and so can't easily afford or afford at all, really, to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, but private sector, non-governmental actions, self-choice, economic differences is what's created residential segregation. We tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. Well, I spent much of my later career before I started working on this book, The Color of Law. I spent it as an education policy writer. I was not really knowledgeable about housing policy. I knew nothing about it. I was writing about education. I was the education columnist at the New York Times for a while. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I wrote many articles criticizing the dominant education policy that we were following in the country at the time. That policy noted that there was a big achievement gap between Black and white students. African American children typically, on average, achieve at lower levels than white children. And the theory was supported across the political spectrum, widely shared, was that the reason for this achievement gap was that teachers just didn't try very hard to teach Black children. They had low expectations for them. Maybe they were bigoted, or maybe they were just lazy. But if only we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap will disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory. But as I say, it was shared across the political spectrum. Some of you who are old enough may remember that in 2001, we passed a law called the No Child Left Behind Act, a federal law that required schools to test children every year, hold their teachers and the schools accountable for those children's test scores, report the test scores by race. And the law predicted that if we simply did that, if we simply shamed teachers and schools into trying harder, the achievement gap would disappear. Black children would achieve at the same level as white children. Well, it's now 20 years out from that law, and the achievement gap is about the same as it was then. The theory didn't work because it's true, of course, there are some teachers who are lazy, some who are bigoted, some who don't try very hard, some who have low expectations, but that's not a big cause of the achievement gap. The main cause of the achievement gap is that so many African American children come to schools with serious social and economic challenges that impede their ability to learn. So, for example, I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, may have read, African American children in urban neighborhoods typically have asthma at a much higher rate than white children. In some places, it's 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. African American children have asthma at such a high rate because they're more likely to live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving by their home, emitting exhaust, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't. It's not true in every case. We're just talking about probabilities. But a child with asthma is more likely to be up at night wheezing and coming to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial composition of the groups, has nothing to do with race, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group is different only in this one respect by having a higher rate of asthma, that group's going to have lower average achievement simply because its children, the members of that group, are drowsier. Well, it makes a small difference. Asthma is not a big cause of the achievement gap, but then you begin to think of all of the social and economic challenges that African American children may come to school with, not just asthma, maybe lead poisoning, which has a measurable impact on IQ, or homelessness, or economic insecurity. And you begin to add all of these up, and you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. Leaves a little bit of explanation left for lazy teachers, but not much. Well, it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. But what happens if you have a school where every child has either one or more of these conditions, how can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come healthy and well-rested and well-nourished from economically secure homes? You can't have that expectation, no matter how many laws like that you pass. As I said, the No Child Left Behind law has been completely ineffective. The only thing it really accomplished was it gave schools with African-American children an incentive to abandon a well-rounded curriculum so they could spend all their time trying to drill children to take tests. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with these kinds of disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. Schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 50 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So as an education policy writer, I began to think that maybe residential segregation was a school problem, was an educational problem. That's how I approached this. I wasn't planning on writing a book about housing policy. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated a program of two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them had a very trivial school desegregation program. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, intensify it, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice who wouldn't do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place at one of the last remaining places in that school. Black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. Trivial program. You don't have one or a few places left and families of different races applying for it and competing for it. But it was a program nonetheless. The Supreme Court evaluated it. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Chief Justice explained, he said, it's true, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. He went on to say that they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. It was a correct observation on the Chief Justice's part. And then he went on to say that those neighborhoods are segregated. The term he used was de facto, something that just happened in fact, not by government. It was created by private bigotry and actions in the private sector and self-choice and income differences. And he said, well, you have segregation that wasn't created by government. Government is not permitted under the Constitution, prohibited under the Constitution from doing anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered something I had read about some years before. There was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb of one of those communities, Louisville, Kentucky. The neighborhood was called Shively. And this white homeowner in Shively had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, well-respected, middle class, had a wife and daughter, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop that. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. Had sold a home to an African-American family in a white neighborhood. And I thought about this and I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. Maybe there's something about the history of Louisville that Chief Justice John Roberts doesn't understand. I then began to look into it further, and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases across the country, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Denver, and San Francisco, and Los Angeles, of police protected, frequently police organized or led mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these cases, and I say there were hundreds of them, was a constitutional violation, civil rights violation. The police are agents of the state It's a 14th Amendment violation for the police to be engaged in protecting racial segregation or promoting it. Every one of these cases requires us as Americans who take our constitutional responsibilities as citizens seriously, requires us to remedy it. But we've never undertaken that responsibility. We've never remedied it. I then began to look into it further, excuse me, and I found there were many sorry, many other federal, state, and local policies equally racially explicit, designed to ensure that we be a segregated society that prevent African Americans and whites from living anywhere near one another. Well, in the few minutes I have with you this evening, before we get to a question discussion period, let me describe just a few of those policies that the federal government followed. Perhaps the most powerful of them was a program in the post-World War II period, that is the 1940s into the 1950s, a program of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration to suburbanize the entire white working class population that was then living in cities and move them into newly created suburbs outside those cities, outside the central area of those cities. At the time, most white working class and middle class families were living in urban areas. They were living in sometimes integrated urban areas, much more integration in the early and mid 20th century than we have today. They were living in those areas because we were a manufacturing economy, making things. Factories needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals, and banks and other service institutions needed to be located near those factories as well. The employees, the workers in those factories and other institutions needed to live close enough to be able to walk to work because many of them didn't have automobiles. So we had a lot of broadly integrated neighborhoods also in the early to mid 20th century. The federal government embarked on a program to move all of the whites out of those urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs, like that neighborhood of Shively outside Louisville that I described earlier. It was a racially explicit program, nothing hidden about it, nothing de facto about it. It was an explicit racial program. The most famous of these, the first of these, the giant development to be built in this period, was east of New York City, Levittown. There were other Levittowns built in Pennsylvania as well afterwards, but the first was Levittown east of New York City. 17,000 homes in that development. An enormous project. We weren't a suburban country at that time. But the banks thought this was a crazy idea that William Levitt wanted to implement 17,000 homes in one place away from the city of New York. No bank would lend William Levitt the money to build Levittown. The only way you could get the funds to build it, to buy the land and to build the houses, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design, the layout of the streets, the materials he's going to use, and a federally required commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a racially explicit requirement of the federal government. It was not done by rogue bureaucrats. This was an official policy of the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA distributed a manual to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of developers who wanted to build these suburban communities, and it was going on everywhere. The manual said explicitly that an appraiser couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who would sell homes to African Americans in one of these all-white communities. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white project that was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. In my book, The Color of Law, some of you may have read it, you know that I have a photograph of a 6-foot high, half-mile long concrete wall that a developer of an all-white project in the Detroit area was required by the federal government to construct to separate his proposed development from a nearby African-American neighborhood as a condition of federal bank guarantees for his project. There's nothing de facto segregation about this. De facto segregation is an utter myth. There's no reality to it whatsoever. This is an unconstitutional system of racial segregation. This particular policy, and there were many, many others, to suburbanize the white population, was a big cause of the wealth gap that we have today between African American and white families. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government to move into these homes bought them inexpensively. In the mid 20th century, they cost about $8,000 or $9,000. In today's inflation-adjusted currency, that's about $100,000. Those homes, for whites only, no longer sell for $100,000, not in Pennsylvania, not in New York, not in California, not anywhere. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places $1 million or more. The white families who were subsidized by the Federal Housing Administration to purchase these homes gained over the next couple of generations equity as their homes appreciated in value, wealth. They used that equity to send their children to college. They used it to take care of temporary emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment, maybe a medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, family incomes are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. That's a big gap. It's not time I have to describe. I don't have time to describe it today. But if there's a 60% income ratio, you'd think that African American wealth will also be 60% of white wealth. You can save the same amount of money from the same income. But in reality, although African American family incomes are 60% of white family incomes, African American household wealth is 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid 20th century, that we've never remedied, that we've never taken up the obligation to remedy. That wealth gap determines much of the racial inequality that we have today on an ongoing basis. I've already described how the wealth gap that locks African Americans into neighborhoods of disadvantage is responsible in good part for the achievement gap in schools. It's responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have, on average, shorter life expectancies, great rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, because they live in segregated, less healthy neighborhoods, more polluted neighborhoods, less access to stores selling fresh food. The wealth gap is also, in large part, responsible for the mass incarceration and police abuse of young African American men that we spent so much time demonstrating about last year in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. I'm not suggesting to you that no police officer would ever abuse an African American man if it weren't for racial segregation, but segregation intensifies it to a great extent when you concentrate, again, the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs, no access to transportation to get to those jobs, no ability to attend schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their students. When you concentrate those young men in single neighborhoods, it's inevitable that the police will engage in confrontations with them. The police in those neighborhoods, whose role it is to contain them in those neighborhoods, the police's role is similar to the role that the occupying forces in colonial countries in the 20th century adopted, whether the British in India or the Belgians in the Congo. This is an inevitable result of concentrating the most disadvantaged section of the population, particular ethnic concentration with that lack of opportunity in a single place. And the wealth gap that reinforces it and to some extent determines our ongoing racial segregation is also responsible for something else that's very frightening and dangerous, I think. I assume you think so as well. And that's the enormous political polarization that we have in this country today. It's frightening. It largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other? We have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other. That's a consequence of the racial segregation that we have created. Well, there are many other policies that the federal, state, and local governments implemented. Let me, in a few minutes, just describe one other major one, and that is public housing. Something we all misunderstand. We think of public housing as a place where poor people live. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country in the 1930s during the Great Depression and the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. Poor people were not permitted into public housing at the time. It was for working class families who could afford to pay the full cost of rent in their housing, for housing, but there was no housing available because there was so little construction being done in the Depression. We had a 75% unemployment rate during the Depression. 25% unemployment rate in the Depression. Public housing was not for those 25% who were unemployed, but for the 75% who had good jobs and could afford to pay rent. But there was no housing available. The very first public housing in this country was created in the New Deal, and it was always segregated. Frequently, segregating those downtown neighborhoods that I talked about earlier that used to be integrated, segregating them for the first time with separate projects for Blacks and whites. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes described in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. That's not how we think of Cleveland today. But he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration, the first federal agency to build public housing, went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. And it did this throughout the country, even in places, self-satisfied, smug places, like Cambridge, Massachusetts, you may have heard of. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood of Cambridge, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, but the federal government demolished housing there to build two separate projects, one for Blacks, one for whites, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. On the West Coast during World War II, hundreds of thousands of white and Black workers migrated to take jobs in the shipyards. The federal government created segregation where it hadn't previously existed because there were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II by building separate projects for whites and for African Americans, segregating them. They hadn't been segregated before. They were working in the same shipyards, same airplane factories, but segregated in their housing by the government. And those segregated neighborhoods where they placed segregated housing are the outlines of the segregation in the Bay Area today and then throughout California. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. Policy experts, think tanks, even journalists like me know what the policies are. What's missing is not a policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement like we had in the 20th century. That's going to make it uncomfortable for us not to implement these policies, which are difficult, as I said earlier, to implement, but which must be implemented if we're going to take our responsibilities as a constitutional democracy seriously. I can mention just a couple of them in a couple of minutes I have remaining, and then we can talk about maybe more of them in the discussion. But for example, I mentioned all these suburban communities that are created across the country that are now unaffordable to African Americans, but which would have been affordable to them in the mid-20th century when they were created, the federal government, as well as the banks, the real estate agencies, and the developers that created these communities as segregated, should now be creating funds to subsidize the movement of African Americans into these communities that would have been affordable to them had they been permitted to live there when they were built, but which are now unaffordable really to working class, middle class families of either race. I've written a couple of articles. I'm doing two things now. I'm working on a new book about what we can do to redress segregation, what these policies are, what local activists can do to redress segregation. I wrote one last year about a community where I described the particular bank and real estate agency and developer that worked with the federal government to create that community as all white, that still remains white today. And I argued in that column that those institutions with the federal government should be setting up a fund to move African Americans into that community that those institutions had segregated. I am now working with a group of national civil rights leaders, as well as working on a new book, to create something we call the New Movement to Redress Racial Segregation, that whose job it will be to create and support and organize local committees of citizen activists, like the civil rights movement of the 1960s, that can begin to take action to make it uncomfortable not to begin to implement policies to desegregate this country. One of the first things that local citizens can do, really anywhere, they don't need the support of this new movement, they can, but we'll give it to them if they want. One of the first things they can do is, as you know, if you read The Color of Law, you know that I describe how the history textbooks that are used in the high schools across this country lie about this history. They promote the myth of de facto segregation, never mentioning any of the policies that I described to you today that are well known to historians and to anybody who's familiar with the 20th century history, never mentioning it, promote the myth of de facto segregation. We, the New Movement to Redress Racial Segregation, have created an alternative curriculum unit that can be used to teach this history accurately. And citizens, you and others like you in your community, can organize a campaign, a respectful campaign, to get your local school district, your superintendent, your principals, your school board to adopt either this or other accurate curricula that are available to teach the history of residential segregation. If the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we have, they're going to be as poor a position to remedy it as we have. And I guarantee you, if you start a conversation in the school system about how you're teaching this history, that conversation will leak out into the broader community and educate some others as well. I mentioned to Brittany that I have a link to this curriculum. It's free, and I can send it to you after this webinar is over, and she can distribute it to you, as long as other links, that article I mentioned in the Times that about the developer, the real estate agency, the bank that created segregation, and a link to if you want more information on the New Movement to Redress Racial Segregation. Let me describe a couple of other policies that we could follow today that I'm writing about in this new book to redress segregation. I mentioned the subsidies that we need to provide as really an affirmative action program for African Americans to live in suburban communities from which they were historically excluded. But we also have programs at the low end of the income distribution that subsidize housing for low-income families, disproportionately African American. And those policies reinforce segregation. The biggest policy that the federal government now has is, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it in some of your work, it's the low-income housing tax credit. It's a tax credit that the Federal Treasury Department distributes to states and then to developers to build housing for low-income families. That program reinforces segregation today because a disproportionate share of those low-income units are being placed in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing that segregation. It's not that we shouldn't place any units in those neighborhoods. Of course we should. Every neighborhood should have better housing, but we should be placing a much higher priority than we presently do of putting affordable housing into communities which are high opportunity places where families who choose to move there can have access to better jobs and transportation and grocery stores selling fresh food and healthier air. The fact that we don't is for a couple of reasons. One is developers would rather build low-income housing in low-income neighborhoods. They don't have to face any community opposition if they build there. The land is cheaper. It's easy to rent because you can put a sign in the window and people walk by, you can see an apartment available. So developers prefer to reinforce segregation. That's not their purpose, but that's the effect. And we need to counter that incentive. The other reason we do it is because many of the communities where we should be putting affordable housing, not only for lower income families, but for middle class and working class families who can't afford to move to these communities now because they're too expensive, and they have zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of anything but single family homes, sometimes even on large lot sizes. Those zoning ordinances that perpetuate an unconstitutionally created segregation should themselves be challenged as perpetuating segregation. That requires a local movement, political action on the part of civil rights activists to do that in their local communities. So as I said, the policies to redress segregation are well known. What's missing is a new movement to redress racial segregation. I'd be glad to discuss this further with you or give you a way to find out more about it if you're interested. And with that, I'm going to conclude and thank you for your attention and engage in whatever discussion you might like in the time we have remaining. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for such an informative talk and for providing these really practical strategies and the resources that we'll send out to everyone following the talk. I do see a question in the Q&A regarding sundown rules. So one of the attendees asks, were sundown rules written in deeds also?
Well, I think you've got the right idea, but you're mixing up two different things. The deeds were clauses that were put into deeds that prohibited the resale of a home to an African American or rental to an African American. Sometimes these clauses weren't put into deeds, but were part of neighborhood association agreements, which permitted neighbors to sue a homeowner if he sold a home to an African American. That's a practice that continued in the 20th century up until about 1950. And if you, any of you, happen to live in a home that was built before 1950, and you look at the deed to your home, there's a good chance that you'll find such a clause in the deed prohibiting you to sell to anybody but a Caucasian. And frequently these were acquired by the federal government. Sundown rules is a different thing. Sundown rules is was a local form of segregation, where communities actually explicitly announced to African Americans that they were not permitted to remain in the community after sundown. This was not a federal program. This was a local program. As I mentioned before, there were many, many policies at the federal, state, and local level that implemented segregation, all of them unconstitutional. If the federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation. These sundown rules were a 14th Amendment violation. They typically were announced with signs at the borders of the community saying, don't be here after dark if you're Black. And there's a wonderful historian whose name is James Loewen, Loewen, who has written a book called Sundown Towns and has a website in which he documents many of these towns that had these rules, many in central Pennsylvania. I don't know if Lancaster is one of them, but It might be, you might check his website to see. So that was another one of the policies that was implemented at the local level to enforce segregation. And Brittany, let me say one other thing. You know, the subtitle of my book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. There was nothing hidden about this. Anybody who lived in those towns saw the sign at the outskirts of the town. It's not this was some secret policy. Anybody who lived in public housing knew that they were being directed to a housing project that had only people of their same race. Anybody who bought a home in these suburbs knew that their deed had a clause prohibiting resale to non-Caucasians. So this was an open policy at the federal, state, and local levels. We've forgotten about it because it's uncomfortable to think about it. Thinking about it requires us to figure out what we're going to do about it. And that's something we'd rather avoid.
All right. Another question is there a way for clauses to be removed from deeds?
The answer is no. There is no way to remove something from a deed. You can't, wake up in the morning and say you want to change your property line. What's in a deed is in a deed. You can't remove it. There are some people who want to strike it out. Some cities and states that have required county clerks to strike these clauses out if a homeowner requests that it be done. Personally, I'm in favor more of writing a supplement to your deed. It's not a part of the deed, but it's a supplement that says something along the lines of, we know that the deed to this home is racially exclusive. We're ashamed and embarrassed about it. It's outrageous that our community once thought that this was acceptable. I want to assert that my community and my home is welcoming to people of all races and ethnicities, and take that clause and staple it on top of the racial clause in the deed. That's a much more, I think, effective thing to do than to simply strike it out and remove the evidence that, we have to teach this history. And of course, it would be nice if we excised this history from our consciousness, never had to look at it again, never had to be aware of it again. But we need to confront it. We need to be faced with it. And so I don't think that even if it were possible to cut these clauses out of deeds, I don't think that's a good idea. But I do think it's a good idea to make an affirmative statement that you have a welcoming community.
Wonderful. How do other communities of color factor into state-sanctioned segregation?
Well, you're in Pennsylvania. Clearly, there are some places in the country, California, Texas, Colorado, where Mexican Americans also faced some state-sponsored segregation, not nearly as intense as African Americans, but it was unconstitutional. The same thing is true of Chinese Americans, and particularly in California and Washington, which experienced that. But the policies that I've been describing that created the segregation patterns in this country were implemented primarily in the eastern and midwestern states, where they affected African Americans. There were very few Hispanics in Pennsylvania, say, in the mid-20th century. This is a fairly recent phenomenon as the country has experienced more immigration from Mexico and Central America. So the policies were directed at African Americans, the unconstitutional policies. That's who the federal bureaucrats were thinking about when they had segregation. That's what these deeds were talking about. Sometimes the deeds also excluded sales to Jews and to Mongolians, but they weren't really enforced against anybody but African Americans. It's certainly true, though, that if we remedy these policies, others than African Americans could benefit from those remedies. For example, now that there are large numbers of low-income Hispanics throughout the country, if we place more low-income housing tax credit units in high-opportunity neighborhoods, Hispanics whose incomes qualify for inclusion in those projects would benefit from them as well. So the policies were implemented in most of the country, except for those few western, southwestern states I talked about earlier, policies directed at African Americans, but many other than African Americans would benefit from redress of them.
There's a pair of questions that I'd like to ask you to address together regarding developing affordable housing in higher income suburban areas. The first one is, how do we ensure that people of color feel safe and accepted in these neighborhoods? And how would you address the argument that instead of relocating folks to these other neighborhoods, that we should invest in these lower income areas?
Well, okay, those are big questions, and nobody is talking, and not at all me, talking about relocating anybody. But there are many African Americans who would like to live in higher opportunity places, and they should be given the opportunity to do it. So nobody's talking about relocating them. We have some programs around the country. There are some communities, for example, that have placed a higher priority on placing these low-income housing tax credit units in higher opportunity places. There are long waiting lists to get into them. We have, in some places, have implemented mobility programs for Section 8 voucher holders. They've gotten special arrangements in their Section 8 programs that enable them to provide extra subsidies and support for families who want to move, who want to use those Section 8 vouchers in higher opportunity neighborhoods. And the waiting list for those are long. So I'm not saying that anybody who doesn't want to move to a higher opportunity neighborhood should have to do it. They can remain in the neighborhoods they're in. And we should certainly try to improve the quality of those neighborhoods. We should do both. But I will say this, there is a fantasy among some policymakers that you can improve the quality of a low-income segregated neighborhood, put better resources in it, better housing, bring in better jobs and supermarkets, and keep it as a racially homogenous neighborhood. That's a fantasy. If you make a neighborhood like that high quality, whites are going to move in. You can't keep it from happening. That's what gentrification is. Separate but equal is no more feasible in housing than it is in schools. And if you make the neighborhoods equal, they'll no longer be segregated. So we should do both. We should both invest in low-income segregated neighborhoods to improve the quality of life for those who continue to live there and want to continue to live there. And we should create opportunities for families who want to move to a more diverse community with more opportunity to do so. If we're going to invest in low-income neighborhoods and create higher quality resources in those neighborhoods, we have to prevent massive dislocation. That is a result of gentrification in many parts of the country today. And again, the policies to do that are well known. We should have rigorous rent control, much more intensive than we have in the few places that have rent control in this country. We should have limits on condominium conversions. We should have inclusionary zoning requirements that require new development to set aside a share of units for lower and moderate income families. And we should freeze property taxes for existing homeowners so that they continue to pay property taxes on the pre-gentrification value of their homes, and then return the lost property taxes to the Treasury at the point where they ever may sell their homes. And instead of making a $500,000 profit, maybe they only make a $400,000 profit on the sale of their home. So those are the kinds of policies we should implement if we want to permit low-income segregated neighborhoods to improve in quality and at the same time prevent massive dislocation of existing residents.
All right. In Pennsylvania, local governments control the zoning, which excludes housing for low-income people. How do you overcome this resistance? And can the low-income housing tax credit program give priority to suburban locations?
It can increase, yes, it certainly can increase the priority. At the present time, I didn't mention this before, the U.S. Treasury Department's regulations place a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. So the opposite priority can be implemented. The way in which the low-income housing tax credit works, as you may know, is a point system that states establish, and they can give greater points to proposals of developers to propose developments in higher opportunity places. So yes, that can be done. It is being done in some places, but not enough and not to a great enough extent.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. How practical are your suggested policies for desegregation?
Well, they're not practically at all unless we have a civil rights movement that's going to create the political pressure to make them happen. You can tell, I guess this is on video, so it's not just audio. You can tell by looking at me, and I'm an old man. I remember when it was impractical to desegregate lunch counters or restaurants or buses, when it was impractical to think of schools being integrated even in places where there are. I remember when it was impractical to think of having an African-American middle class that were lawyers and doctors and working in mainstream institutions. That all happened because we had a civil rights movement in this country that created enough pressure to make the country face up to desegregating those institutions. I'll tell you one quick story. I know we're almost out of time, but I'll tell you one quick story. When in the 1960s, the mid-1960s, I was working as a researcher for the Chicago Urban League. And I had to, my job was to count up all of the supervisory and policy-making positions in the private sector in Chicago, in the corporate sector, and identify how many of them were held by African Americans. And Chicago, as you know, about 35% African American at the time. I identified 4,000 policymaking positions in the corporate sector of Chicago at that time. Not a single one was held by an African American. Not one out of 4,000 not even a shipping department supervisor was an African American in Chicago in the mid-1960s. Well, I was young and naive. I probably didn't appreciate how significant that was. But if you had asked my research director if in 15 years you would have a diverse executive suite in every corporation in Chicago, he would have said you were crazy. That was inconceivable. And it wasn't conceivable at the time. And yet today you could not have a corporation in Chicago that did not have African Americans working in all kinds of supervisory positions. So that happened because there was a civil rights movement in Chicago and throughout the country. And so today, the policies I'm talking about are entirely impractical. But old men can tell you that the things that seemed impractical at one time may later come to be if there's a political movement to create them.
Okay, what a great note to end on. Thank you so much for such a wonderful discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Shelby to close out the program.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rothstein. We really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone that's with us for joining us tonight. Our goal is to continue these important conversations to expand housing opportunity for all the members of our community. I wanted to tell you about something really exciting. At the conclusion of this series, the speaker series, we'll send out a survey to everyone who attended, and the first 50 people to complete the survey will receive a copy of The Color of Law for free. So look for that survey coming out after our final speaker, which is Allie Cannington on disability forward housing on June 22nd. If you follow us on social media, Tenfold, or also the other Facebook page that you can follow us on is the Lancaster Coalition #4 Sustainable Housing. We're sharing information there as well. The last thing I'll tell you about also on our Facebook page, last week's speaker, Dr. Tiffany Manuel's video is there if you'd like to catch up on her talk from 2 weeks ago. And with that, I will thank everyone once again for being with us and wish you have a great night.
Thank you.